Hello, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to rehearse and just take a look back at an introduction to Christian apologetics and try to be as tight and as well in shape on this question as we can be. So, what is Christian apologetics? Well, the word apologetic, it comes from an old Greek word, apologia or apologomai. What does that word mean? It means like a reasoned defense, a rational defense. It means like persuasive reasoning. It doesn't mean any sort of persuasive speech, but it's persuasive reasoning. It's something you would do in a court case. So like Socrates, gave his apologia in court to prove his innocence. It was his reasoning. Paul gave his apologia before King Agrippa to give his reasoning why he hadn't committed any crimes. You trot out evidence and you reason from the evidence. Now, there are some objections people have to the question of Christian apologetics, because Christian apologetics, essentially, what we're going to wind up doing is giving proof for what we believe. We're not here to shoot down stuff so much as we're here to tell you, to believe this, that, and the other. And so we're here to prove what we believe when we do Christian apologetics. And so some people have a problem with Christian apologetics just because they haven't heard it before, or it seems new to them, although it's actually quite old. I mean, you can find Christians I've read arguments from Christians to give proof for the existence of God. Athanasius was making an argument for proof for the existence of God, before the fall of 100 years before the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, and it's not like he was the first one to do that, or like he was some fluke. It was common. It was normal. Augustine, right? Aquinas. Those are two of the giants who are considered the architects of the Middle Ages in terms of their writing and thinking, and they were all about it. That they were consumed with that question. So it's not a new thing at all. It's as old as Christianity is. The age of the Christian apologies is actually the second 100 years after the time of Christ. You start having Christians like Justin Martyr writing apologetic works to reason and prove things. So that objection is kind of silly. The next objection you hear is, sort of the intellectual laziness motivation of, well, why do we have to do this? Why can't we just have faith? Just have faith. If I just believe it and don't question it, I don't want to have to deal with that. Well, the problem is that doesn't really help you stay protected. Like, in other words, if someone gets up there and tells you, believe this because I'm the guy who's the authority and you have to believe this, then that may produce belief in you. It may produce faith, but it won't produce knowledge. You won't really know that it's true. You'll just believe it. And so if someone else comes along, let's say you're in some other situation and there's like a Muslim guy and he tells you to believe some other thing, are you just going to go with that? Are you going to believe what you can actually, what did you actually know to be true? So there's that. Some people say, object to giving proof for what we believe by simply saying that, oh, there's a lot, look at all these experts out there, all these great scientists, or whoever, whatever, historical scholars and philosophers and mathematicians, and they're all, they're all these really smart guys, and they're atheists. So you can't mess with that. You might as well not even try. Again, it's sort of a justification for intellectual laziness. At the end of the day, it makes sense to believe whatever the experts tell you, like you can't study everything and know everything. You're going to have to just go with the experts. And I mean, that's not unreasonable to do. That's kind of their job. But like, the problem is that the Bible tells us to do Christian apologetics, at least for the core of what we believe as Christians. It says so. We're commanded to do it in 1 Peter 3:15. So you can defy the experts. You can come to the experts and say, hey, experts, you guys are wrong. But only if you're willing to shoulder the burden of proof. Luckily, you can shoulder it, because when it comes to the existence of God, this is more based on reasoning than like going out and searching the universe for every bit of evidence. But anyway, so just to be clear, 1 Peter 3:15 says this, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. And that word where it says make a defense, it's make an apologetic or make an apologia, or literally make a reasoned defense, a rational defense. Okay, so now another objection people raise is sometimes people say to me that only science can prove things, and you can't scientifically prove God. So like, in other words, they say God is unobservable, he's supernatural, and so like, how can we confirm or falsify whether or not God exists? Because the only way to know anything is with empirical observations, and you can't observe God, and that's the only way to know anything. Now, the problem with that idea is that it's literally self-refuting. That's just the classical error of the verification principle of logical positivism. It's kind of cliche now, but it's like a ghost that lives on. But like, essentially, how do you use your observations to verify your observations? Like, in other words, you're basing that whole idea on your reasoning. And so if you can base that idea on your reasoning, then, and in fact bad reasoning, because that's circular reasoning, then perhaps you could, use reasoning to figure out some other things. As long as you do use good reasoning instead of bad reasoning, clearly. Okay. Another issue people raise is, how on earth can, so many people come to faith in Christ without ever learning apologetics? Well, what the Bible tells us in the first chapter of Romans is that the evidence for God is, just to very briefly state it, the evidence for God is just in everything he's made. The evidence for God is giving us like a bird's eye view of the existence of God, is the actual language that it uses there. So if we do a little bit of reasoning from the scriptures, and we start to realize, like, well, wait a minute, the things God has made, now wait a minute, like, that doesn't just mean like a sunset, or I don't know, like the New York City skyline or something like that. That means literally everything you've ever seen or heard or touched or felt or experienced in your life was made by God. If God does exist and God is the creator, then like, God's the creator of everything other than himself. So like, everything you've touched is proof for God's existence. Everything you've seen. So if that's the case, then there's so much proof for God's existence that we can't even hardly take it all in. And what you probably would find, if what Paul says in Romans 1 is correct, what you probably would find is a lot of people who believe in God, but are not very capable of explaining why they believe, but they just, for some reason, somehow they just know. And the fact of the matter is, that's actually a very common experience in life. There are a lot of things in your life where you know the facts, but you have a hard time explaining the facts. Like how you feel at any given time. It's very difficult. Any experience in your life specifically exactly is what it actually is like. What are my experiences really like? Well, I can try to explain it. Maybe I can take a picture and share that with you, but it's unlikely that you'll really get it. And so if every single thing you've ever experienced in your life is proof for God's existence, it gives you a bird's eye view of God, then you probably would just kind of just be overwhelmed with what God is like, but not be able to explain it. So Christian apologetics has come in over the centuries, and essentially what it's doing is trying to just tease out a little bit of that. Trying to pull out of the overall evidence for God that the Bible tells us there is, a little piece of it. A solid piece, an inescapable, irrefutable piece, but nonetheless a small piece of the bigger proof. And we do it because we're commanded to do it. And the way it comes in handy is what Paul goes on to tell us in the book of Romans is that since the proof for God's existence is obvious to all, although, I mean, it probably wouldn't be so easy to explain, nonetheless, deep down, everybody really knows. So think about it. There are a lot of people who don't believe, who reject God, what Paul tells us in the book of Romans is actually before you come to Christ at some point in your life, that's everyone. So what that means is you're probably, well, if a person knows that a certain thing is the case and just really and has plenty of proof, but just decides not to believe it anyway, then that person will probably have a hard time living with that. That won't be an easy way to go through life. Knowing that this is true and knowing for 100% certain that this is true and just rejecting it anyway. And so what Paul tells us is people come up with all sorts of what he calls futile thinking. That in their hearts they think they are wise, but really it's futile thinking and their hearts are darkened. And so what Paul is saying is like people come up with what we might call a rationalization, what in logic might be fallacious reasoning. Essentially, something that sounds correct, sounds like it makes a lot of sense, sounds like it's good reasoning, but it's actually bad reasoning when you take a closer look at it. And so what he says is that's what people do. So like that's where Christian apologetics comes in. What we do is when someone comes at us with some great reason why they shouldn't believe, we just debunk that, we deal with that. And then that allows us to get back to the real problem. And this is what Jesus is, constantly talking about, with the Jews. Jesus gave them proof after proof after proof after proof that he was sent from God. But the problem, and he makes it very clear, the problem is not that they don't have enough proof. The problem is that they don't want to have proof. And you need to ask yourself that. How would I feel if I found out there was proof for God's existence? Would I want that to be the case? Okay, so now given that long introduction, let's go through just a little bit of Christian apologetics. There's way more than this, but we're just going to give you a teaser, just an introduction. One of the first things you've got to do when it comes to Christian apologetics, if you're going to be doing it in real life, is you've got to study Jesus and notice how Jesus was very good at asking questions. Whenever people were going to debate, Jesus on something, they often challenged him. He was, in what he believed and what he claimed, and he always came back at them with questions. And so I don't want to move past this faster than I need to, but like a lot of time in life, it's important for you to ask questions instead of telling people what to think. But for the purposes of this video, I think it's more important that you get a flavor of actual reasoning. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you historical evidence that Jesus really rose from the grave. And then we're going to give you a logical proof for God's existence. Now, the historical evidence argument won't go so far as to prove it beyond, the shadow of a doubt, but it'll just prove that it's more likely that he rose from the grave than that he did not. And then we'll give you a logical argument that proves that it's an irrational, illogical absurdity for God not to exist. Okay, so we'll start with historical evidence. So first of all, we need to think about historical evidence and like how that works. So essentially what we have are ancient documents, ancient writings. And think about it this way. Think of whatever year is 10 years before you were born. So for me, I was born in 1981. So that means that 10 years before that would be 1971. Let's imagine that someone just made up Christianity. They made up the resurrection. They made up the whole, everything Christianity is. They made all of that up in 1971. Okay, so that means that like all of my grandparents and my parents and everyone who claims that like Christianity existed in the 1960s, that, and they went to church, that they didn't actually go to church. There was no such thing. All of the photos I've seen are fakes. The history books that I've read, all of those are fakes. It's easy to see that, like, it's more likely that just the Bible and Christianity existed in the 1960s. It's just really unreasonable to say that it was made up in 1971. Like, that would be a massive conspiracy. Think about how many people would have to be in on that scam, just to scam all of us later. They build all these fake old-looking churches and like rewrite all the history books and go like there's even like archaeology that they would have to go like alter, and like records everywhere. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Okay. But it's not impossible. It could be done, right? As far as I know. But it's just really unlikely. Okay? So, first of all, if you understand that, you're getting a feel for how historical evidence works. Okay? Sometimes people come at me and they say that, like, there's no such thing as historical evidence. I had somebody say that one time. He's like, well, we there's no way anyone can know anything about anything, in the past, very long ago. And that's kind of silly. So, let's reverse it and let's go back and let's just take a look at, okay, Jesus. Let's say Jesus existed, but let's say that he did not raise from the dead, that Jesus faked his own resurrection. He faked it. Okay, how could he have faked it? I mean, like, there were witnesses that saw him crucified. They saw, they buried him, like all that. And not only that, like, not only would he be faking being killed and still be alive, but like he would have to convince people that he resurrected, that he was now beyond death. He had defeated death. So like, that's really silly to think that like he just convinced people of that. That like no one was ever like, oh yeah, well I'm gonna punch you, you know? Especially given that there were witnesses of him, being executed and buried and all that. So he would have had to have at least been incredibly injured and in bad shape. And so even if he was alive, he would not only have to convince people that, he was alive, but that he defeated death and that he wasn't even hurt. And so you'd have this guy say, oh, I defeated death. And it's like, it's ridiculous. Okay. Now you could have, all right, so like that's out. That's ridiculous. Well, let's think about it this way. What if, how about this? Jesus didn't fake his own death. The apostles, the witnesses of Jesus' death, the messengers, the apostles, the messenger witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, those guys made it up. Like I said, those guys made it up. Now this is actually, according to the Bible, this is what people said in the days of the resurrection. This is what the opponents said. The problem with this view is that the apostles were willing to die for their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. They were willing to die for it. They were constantly willing to die for it, over and over again, every day. All right. So there you have it. Now, you could say to me, like, well, just because someone's willing to die for something, it doesn't mean that it's true. So, like, for example, today, there are a lot of people who are willing to die for the teachings of Muhammad. That doesn't make, Muhammad true, because how could that make Muhammad true? But then the apostles, are willing to die for Christianity, so that makes Christianity true. That seems like that doesn't make any sense. But those are apples and oranges. That's two totally different cases, because the apostles would have had to actually made up the story about Jesus. They wouldn't have been, Muhammad lived in 600 AD or 610 AD. So like, that's 1,400 years ago. So anyone today who's willing to die for that, they didn't make it up. They were taught it all their life, and everyone in their community believes it. But the apostles would not only have been willing to die for it, they would have been willing to die for something that they knew wasn't true, because they made it up. That's the issue with the apostles. Not just that they were willing to die for something that wasn't true, they're willing to die for something that they absolutely knew wasn't true, because they made it up. Okay? Now, the only way around that is you could say, well, maybe they were just crazy. The problem with the idea that they were just crazy is it doesn't produce consistency of message for people to be insane. I mean, insane people are insane. They're not going to be consistent like that. So that's a major problem. All right, so it takes time at least. So the apostles, they were genuine. They believed it. But here's what you could do. You could say, well, perhaps the lives of the apostles were made up. The apostles were imaginary. Because, I mean, obviously they believed what they said. And they knew it wasn't true. So here's a way of taking a look at it. All right, the apostles were made up. the apostles didn't exist. Or maybe they weren't willing, major components of their story was made up. Like, they didn't originally say anything about Jesus rising from the dead, or they never said anything like that. And they never they never were executed for what they believed. But people who came later made up the apostles. So like in the next generation, the apostles were made up, right? And this is what's called this. So just FYI, when it comes to evidence for Jesus, this is called the legendary hypothesis. And this is essentially what you have to, this is the whole argument. Like, Jesus could not have made it up. And the apostles could not have been lying. So you have to push it back to the next generation of people. That's called the legendary hypothesis. Essentially, either Jesus rose from the dead, or it's a legend. Or maybe there was an explosion in the printing presses or something, in 1971. But you get my point. So this is where historical evidence comes to bear. We're at a situation now where you've got a group of people who essentially are imaginary, who never really existed. Maybe someone like them existed, but the apostles that we hear about, they who were willing to die for their be martyred for their story of Jesus, they never existed. They were never preaching Jesus as we understand him, and they were never willing to die for it. Okay. Well, there's a few issues with this. And this is where it becomes the historical evidence question. So, first of all, we've got numerous historical documents that can be reliably dated to just a few years after the apostles' deaths, and those historical documents claim that the apostles were willing to die. Now you could say, well, those were made up. Those historical accounts were fakes. And these historical accounts, like, we've got a lot of them, like the Clement of Rome. Let's see. I think I'm forgetting them now. Ignatius they both claim that Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. People don't realize it, but the book of John, in the last chapter, claims that Peter was martyred. These are all very ancient texts. So now, what you could do is you could say, well, those were made up. Those were just that's how the lie got started when those texts were written. We've got numerous texts. But we could just focus on those three. Although the book of 1 Corinthians too it doesn't ever, 1 and 2 Corinthians, to be fair, they don't really claim that Paul was martyred, but they go through great detail of how he lived a martyr's lifestyle, how he was constantly willing to die, but he a lot of times would just get away. We've got the book of Acts too that talks about this. So you've got the book of Acts, the book of 1 Corinthians, the book of 1 John, and Clement the First of Rome, and Ignatius. So these are ancient writings from different places around the Mediterranean. Clement is writing from Rome. Ignatius is writing from Antioch, and then we're not real sure about John, the book of John, but Luke probably wrote Acts, and Paul probably wrote Corinthians. They probably wrote both those from Greece. So now you could say, well, those are made up. Those those are made up. Like, why should I believe those books? Those are made up, dude. Well, you run into a problem because they are more than one account. So here's the issue, and this is part of the logical reasoning. If someone makes something up, what are the odds that multiple people would make up the same thing? Not good. It's just inherent in the nature of a lie that a lie will be unique. So consistency of story, especially from different sources, makes it unlikely that a lie, that it's a lie. So, so in other words, like, if I was going to tell a lie, it's incredibly unlikely that some other guy, even who lives 10 miles down the road, would just so happen to make up the same lie. It's more likely that we would make up different lies. But we've got a consistent story here, especially Peter and Paul are, executed, living a martyr's lifestyle for their proclamation of the message of Jesus, which is in all of those accounts. Clement, Ignatius, they're very clear on it. In case I know you probably haven't read those, but trust me, if you can look them up, they're going to be very clear on what Paul and Peter and Paul were teaching, what Christianity is. That's kind of the point of those letters. They're not even written to say that those guys died. They just mention it. But it's really just, more about, that those guys died. Well, what Christianity is. So what you could do is you could say, all right, this is what happened. One guy made up those stories and wrote them all and spread them around. But they were all made up by one source or one group of people who worked together and communicated with each other to get their story straight. But essentially it's unlikely that they just accidentally just made up the same story. So they had to communicate with each other, right, to get their story straight. That's how it worked. Okay, so that's fair enough. The problem is, there's still a problem. If that happened, there would have had to have been someone else who wrote a story and said, hey, wait a minute, that's not how that happened. It wasn't like that at all. There should have had to have been a debunker story, an alternate version, right? I mean, where are the debunkers? Where are the people who come out and say, hey, now that's not what happened. I know what happened. What are the odds that no one ever at least told, word of mouth, a different version of things? I mean, it's just unlikely that no one ever said, hey, that's not what happened. Right? So, you could say, well, I mean, the debunker versions, they were just, they were suppressed because eventually later on in time, Christianity gained political power. You can't really say that no one told them or that they weren't important because Christianity was important. But you could say well, they were suppressed later on, Well, that's ridiculous to say that they were suppressed. I mean, really, how can you really suppress a story? How do you really do that? You ever think about that? How ridiculous that would be to just stop people from talking? We have this belief, it's a ridiculous belief that Christianity stopped the old paganism by force of the government when Constantine came to power.
It's ridiculous, and it's not true. Not only did he not do that, there were attempts to do that clearly failed. And so this story is a hoax perpetrated by a Christian named Eusebius, who came along, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to say that all of the old paganism is gone because Christianity has just mightily taken over and used the mighty force of the government and gotten rid of all the old paganism. When all of the historical evidence that we have suggests that that did not happen. And in fact, the old paganism lived on and largely blended into Christianity. And not only did it live on, it's still with us today. You still have pagan beliefs. Like, Christianity has been working to get rid of paganism, and it's gotten rid of a lot of it, but it's still with us. Like, do you still know what a wishing well is? That's pagan. That's pre-Christian pagan idea. Even anti-Semitism, even racism against Jews, that goes back to hundreds of years before Christianity. The idea that Jews are these, like, Scrooge McDucks, you know, that's old. Halloween is 100% a pagan holiday. So, like, think about it. Like, if the Romans, just by the force of their mighty violence, suppressed paganism, then, like, why did the celebrations of paganism never stop, and they still go on to this very day? Eusebius wanted to claim that, like, oh yeah, Christians got rid of paganism because that's what people wanted to hear and, you know, wanted to believe. But there was a lot of blending that went on. You know, even the word God is a pagan word, but we've Christianized it. It doesn't mean Thor and Odin anymore. So the idea that, you know, there were these debunker versions of Christianity they would just suppress, that's ridiculous. What makes more sense is that they were just lost. They were just forgotten. They had to exist. You could just say, well, they were forgotten. But there's a big problem with that. And the big problem with that goes back to the 2nd century apologists, the 2nd century Christian apologists that I was talking about earlier. And Christian apologists who kept writing and writing and writing. Okay, so looking at what we know, we have through ancient archaeology, we found, you know, the ruins of ancient libraries of the ancient world. And we can see how big they were. And it's been estimated that, you know, given the amount of written material that would have filled up these libraries, probably 90% of the writings of the ancient world were just lost to time. They weren't lost because someone burned them. They just don't last. The paper that was used back in those days was a thing called papyrus, a plant called papyrus, and it just doesn't hold up to time. Around the Middle Ages, Christians started preserving ancient documents on something called parchment or vellum. And I think those are two different things. But parchment paper is made from sheepskin, and it's very durable. It's incredibly durable. In fact, it's probably more durable than your hard drives and that sort of thing. But we don't have complete copies, truly complete copies of any ancient document before like 600, 700-ish AD. What we have are complete copies that date from the Middle Ages. And you say, well, there you go. They had plenty of time to get their story straight. They had plenty of time to get rid of all the disagreeing documents. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Now you're jumping the gun. What we do have from the ancient world are lots and lots and lots of fragments. Pieces of papyrus paper that are like eroded partially, with chunks missing, you know, holes in them, maybe just a little scrap. But what we can do with those chunks is lay them down on the parchment version from the Middle Ages, and all of the words and letters line up. So it's clear that, like, obviously this is a page from the same book we've got here, and I mean, what are the odds that all of the words and even letters line up? But also, we're finding thousands upon thousands of these, not just of the Bible, but of all sorts of ancient documents, and the numbers keep going up. So we're up to like 1,400 copies of the Iliad with the old story of the Trojan War, and just little fragments, just a piece of paper or something. So if people were making changes to these ancient documents over the centuries, why do we keep and we keep finding thousands upon thousands upon thousands of ancient copies? Why do we keep finding no changes? Like, why do we keep finding the piece that doesn't have the changes? It's kind of an issue. So here's the thing, and here's the important thing for us to think about right here. Remember what we said, these debunkers, they have to exist. I mean, if people were spreading lies, even getting together as a group and spreading lies about about the apostles being willing to die, well, they could have, done that, but there would have had to have been debunker versions. Now, you could say those debunker versions got suppressed, but then that's actually ridiculous. You could say, well, they were lost. The debunkers were lost because 90%, the estimates are 90% of ancient documents were lost. Well, that's fine. That's dandy. But the problem is, one of the things that we have best preserved are the attacks on Christianity. And the way they are preserved is in the form of Christian apologetics. So, for example, the Roman Emperor Julian wrote a long text called Against the Galileans, which was an anti-Christian writing. It was doing its best to go out of its way to shoot down Christianity. And we have a lot of this. A lot of this stuff. And so the question is, why is there no mention of those ideas that the apostles, no one ever tried to shoot down, that the apostles were willing to die for Christianity? I mean, these guys, you see, the reason they're preserved, even though these are anti-Christian texts, the reason they're preserved is because Christians wrote responses to them. They quoted them at length and then wrote rebuttals. And so they're preserved within Christian texts that were jealously guarded and made sure to make copies and copies and copies, and we still have them today, complete copies. But we have tons and tons and tons of these anti-Christian texts, especially their anti-Christian arguments. And so the issue is, these people were going like they would hate on Peter, and just try everything they could to criticize and shoot down and call Peter and Paul just terrible guys. But never once do they say this theory that people want to say today. Never once does it come up. In fact, if I remember right, one of these guys goes so far as to say that the proof that Peter was a bad person is because he was executed for his Christianity. So, it's more likely than not that he was executed. We have good evidence to support that.
That's the best explanation of the evidence we have, is that it did in fact happen. And then if they were willing to die for it, then it probably was true, and that means Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so we've just done some Christian apologetics for you. That doesn't prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt, but it's just like a teaser to get you going, to get you thinking. Now, what we're going to do at this point is switch gears and think about a proof for God's existence. So you may say, well, that's just ridiculous. How can someone prove that God actually exists? How is that possible? Well, let's just think about it. First of all, God's existence is a lot different from Jesus rising from the dead, because if God actually exists, then God exists everywhere. So like, God is the foundation of reality. God is the source from which all reality springs. It's not just one thing that happened in history. God is always and forever the core of reality. So like, the question when it comes to God's existence is not what evidence is there for God's existence, but rather what sort of, does reality exist? Well, of course reality exists. Okay, well then the question is, what is reality really like? Is there a being behind all of reality, or is there not? That's the real question. So, one of the classic arguments, and one of the easier ones for people to grasp, is the moral argument for God's existence. And the moral argument for God's existence works like this. It simply says that there is no such thing as good and evil, right and wrong, unless God exists. There is such a thing as good and evil and right and wrong. Therefore, God exists. So, that's the outline, or in logic, that's called the syllogism of the argument. But it's like an outline. Okay, so now we need to fill in the rest of the work. But that's the framework. Right and wrong, good and evil only exists if God exists. Right and wrong exists, therefore God exists. So like, if those first two are true, then God has to exist. But if either of these are not true, one or both, then God doesn't exist. Now, with teenagers, what they usually say is, well, morality is subjective, and it's just whatever people think it is. It's just something people made up, so that they could get along in life. So this objection from teenagers is kind of ridiculous, but they don't quite grasp it. Essentially, this objection from teenagers it's kind of like this. Let's say I came up to you and I asked you, does your mother know that you are stupid? Okay? So it's a classic trick question, because like, if you say yes, then you are stupid and your mother knows. If you say no, then you are stupid and your mother doesn't know. And if you say I don't know, then you are too stupid to understand the question. No matter what you say to this question, you are stupid. Right? So, essentially, what I've done is I've taken reality and I've said, it's either A, B, C, or D. Let's just pretend that there's no D and make you pick between A, B, or C. Or let's say that, like, I come up to you and I say, you're either a Nazi or a communist. Which are you? And I say, well, neither. But that's how this works. What teenagers do is they notice that the human concept of perfection is changing and growing and improving. And so they say morality is just whatever people say it is. The problem with that is that that doesn't mean that morality is just a subjective thing that people just make up, but rather it can also mean that morality is something that's objectively real, but we don't know everything there is to know about it. So in other words, you probably would say that, murdering a baby is objectively evil. And I think all of us would agree of that. But that doesn't mean we objectively know everything there is to know about good and evil, but rather that we're coming to a better and better understanding of what really is good and what really is evil. So, just because we don't know everything there is to know about good and evil in every situation, it doesn't mean that it's totally subjective and all just a made-up thing. Just because, so what teenagers think is objective morality means we know everything there is to know about it. No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that there is an objective standard out there, and we know it must exist because we know a little bit about it. But it doesn't mean that we know everything there possibly could ever be to know about it. Christians have always believed in rational theology, which is a progressively better understanding of God, where you go back to the Bible and you reason from it to get a better reasoning, a better understanding. That's what Paul and the apostles were doing. They went back to the Old Testament and reinterpreted Old Testament prophecies in light of what they had witnessed with Jesus, and they were coming to a better understanding of the Bible and a better understanding of God. So, yeah. And I think everyone understands that, there has to be some objective morality, or else it would be, the idea that, murdering a baby would be, is evil. It's just your subjective fantasy. It's not actually evil. It's just what people told you. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, we all know that that's evil. But at the same time, there's more to learn about good and evil. We can come to a better, more refined understanding. At one time in the past, people thought slavery was okay. Now we know that, hey, what were we thinking? That's wrong, right? So, who's to say that, people 1,000 years from now might think that we're barbaric? And, just, one example I've heard recently is just taxation does seem kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Does it really make sense that the government comes to you and tells you you have to buy something, and if you don't want to buy the thing, then you're an evil person? And we're going to lock you in a cage until you say you're sorry, and or even, you can even say you're sorry, you still got to be locked in the cage, We're going to lock you in a cage, because you didn't want to help pay to bomb Syria. And you're like, well, I don't want to bomb Syria. I don't got anything against those guys. It doesn't matter. You gotta help us blow them up, the smithereens. I don't know. That's just a theory. Maybe you would want to argue about that, but maybe 1,000 years from now, they're all going to look at us and say, I can't believe you guys were even remotely okay with something. Just like we look at people who were okay with slavery. Even when women wanted the right to vote, it was a small minority of women who fought for that. And they were they had to have support from a lot of men to get that to happen. But most women and most men didn't cross their mind that women should have the right to vote. Now we think differently, right? And this idea of understanding history, sometimes we're anachronistic and we think that these people in the past were evil. In reality, they just didn't, they were just believing what they had always believed. So it's common for us today to believe that slavery's evil. They didn't know, no one thought that back then. If you were born 1,000 years ago,
Well, not 1,000 years ago, because 1,000 years ago people did have the idea. But if you were born 2,000 years ago, well, no, not 2,000, but it depends where you lived, I guess. If you were born in ancient Egypt, it would have never crossed your mind. Yeah. So that's probably one of the primary objections. Another objection you get to this argument is people say that, well, just because, and it's a very different objection, is they say just because, someone's an atheist, it doesn't mean that they can't know the difference between right and wrong. I don't have to believe in God to be a good person. Well, that's actually even more ridiculous, because that's exactly what the argument is saying. It's saying right and wrong exists if and only if God exists. Right and wrong exists, therefore God exists. Okay, if you say, well, I don't have to believe in God to know the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying everybody, I don't care what you believe or don't believe, I don't care if you're atheist or whatever, you know that some things are good and some things are evil. That's the point of the argument. That's what we're saying. But then what we're saying is, since you know that, logically, the only way you could know that, or the only way that that could be true, since you know it to be true, the only way it could be true is if and only if God exists. Okay? Now you may say to me, well, alright, Ben, I get that there's such a thing as objective standards of good and evil, even though we're progressing in our understanding of it. But, does that mean that we had to have God to give us that, or to be the foundation for why that exists? I mean, maybe exists some other way. Well, this is the logical reasoning of the argument. Essentially, what is morality? What are morals? The belief that something is good and that something else is bad is a desire. It is an idea about the way the world ought to be, about the way things should be and should not be. It is a desire. Morality is a fundamental component of what it means to be somebody, a person, a personal being. It's just fundamentally what it is. That's just a basic building block of what makes you a thing, a person, instead of just an it or a thing. That you have desires, wishes, about the way the world ought to be, about the way the world should be. So there's that. That's just fundamentally, what good and evil is. So the only way you can have moral laws that are absolute and objectively true, whether you like it or not, even if our understanding of them needs fine-tuning and that kind of thing, but there has to be some objective moral law, or else we can't be discovering it progressively. And there's some things we know to be wrong. Like today, we're all in agreement, right? Slavery's abhorrently evil. I don't have to... Because if you come into me with your subjective morality, then you have to say, well, the belief that, slavery's evil, that's just your subjective opinion. Which I think is ridiculous. It's objectively evil. And we know this. And one day we'll have a better understanding of objective morality because we'll have a better understanding of God. But here's the thing. For something to be objectively wrong, for the universe, no matter where you go, that would be evil. If we went to... Slavery would be evil if we went to the other side of the Milky Way galaxy. It would still be evil to enslave over there. That it's an absolute moral law.
and it doesn't matter who you are or how much you want to wag your finger and say it's wrong, or say, slavery is okay, you're just wrong. Then that means there has to be an absolute moral lawgiver, a foundation of goodness, a being who is the determiner for what is good and evil for all reality. And so the point we're making with just this, there's way more we could say. Like, this is just a proof for God's existence, and I guess one of the common comebacks people give you, the only other comeback I guess that we even need to deal with is like, people say, well, okay, morality is an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. There's no such thing as good and evil. It's just a idea. It's not a delusion. It's not a subjective delusion, but it's an illusion. It's forced on you by your like biology and like brain chemicals and stuff, and like you're just caused to believe that because of the way your body's made and the way your brain's made, and it isn't real. So like there's all kinds of things like that, like where your mind's playing tricks on you, and this is just something that like all humans believe in because it turned out to be good in the evolutionary history, and so it's all an illusion. So in other words, if someone defends that position, then what they're saying is slavery's not evil. That's what they're saying. Okay? So we need to, people, in other words, like people say that morality is an illusion out of one side of their mouth, and then out of the other side of their mouth they want to say things like, like you get these atheists who say, morality is just a big illusion. But then out of the other side of their mouth they'll say like God is evil because God allowed this bad thing to happen and that bad thing to happen. It's like we can't have both ways. God's not evil if there's no such thing as evil. Okay. All right. But anyway, the problem with this is that biological, in other words, like, this is a reductionist view that says that all of your thoughts and beliefs are merely chemical reactions in your brain, to say it in a ridiculously simplistic way. But for our purposes, it doesn't really need to, some sort of physical process explains all of your thoughts and beliefs. Even your belief that, like, something is good and something is bad is just a physical process. Okay, so that's reductionism, that everything you think reduces to just that. Okay, so this is the point where look at how far people are having to go to get out of the conclusion that God exists. Look at the hurdles they're willing to jump over. They're willing to believe anything before they believe that. I mean, they're ridiculous. This is obstinance. This is just absurd. Like, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this gets back to that issue of like, do you really want God to be real, or would you rather believe anything before you believe God's real? So like, you're going to say that like all of your thoughts and beliefs are just illusions created by chemical reactions in your brain. That's where you're at. Well, you need to stop doing science, or really anything. Because, like, how do you know if any of your beliefs are true then? I mean, how do you know if any of your beliefs are true? If you don't have the free will to control what you believe. If when you say I love you, and when you say I hate you, and when you say I'm ambivalent, that you don't actually choose that. You don't have any control. It's just the physical process, and the chemicals react because of their inherent properties.
They don't choose to react in any certain way. They just have certain properties, and that's how they function according to their properties. Well, that means that you can't really know if anything you believe is actually true or not, because you don't have any control. The chemicals might react to give you false beliefs. They might react to give you true beliefs. Now, what you could do is you could say, I've got this theory, this theory. I've got a theory about how the brain developed. How the brain of people developed. And my theory proves that the brain would develop in such a way to give us true beliefs. Well, that's circular reasoning, you see, because what this is the constant thing. Out of the one side of my mouth, this thing, and out of the other side of my mouth, I deny the thing. Like, that's simply saying, I can trust the beliefs given to me by these mental states, these physical processes. And the reason I know that I can trust them is because they say so. Yeah, that's circular reasoning. But it's worse than saying, I'm right because I'm right. That's logically, that's what you're saying. I'm right because I'm right. But it's worse than that, because it applies to every single belief you ever have is circular reasoning at that point. You're locked into that system. So that's one problem with reductionism. One of the other problems with reductionism is, thinking is a serious problem for reductionism. It just lacks explanatory power. Anytime we need to know that we're right, we don't about anything. If we don't allow for some sort of supernatural spirit or soul or something like that. As Christians, you don't have to deny that the human brain plays a major factor in affecting your thoughts and wishes and desires and intentions. Like, you don't have to deny it, because the Bible's replete with affirming the existence of that, and affirming the existence of the flesh and the body and its effect on your thoughts and temptations. Jesus said the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. That's nothing new. The Christianity has always affirmed the duality of those two. Okay, so, but the larger question is, how can good and evil really emerge from that? How can mechanical processes that just function because they just happen to fall together and then, or get started. I'm not trying to say it couldn't have got started that way, but how can that process produce the belief in good and evil, in bad and good, and right and wrong? A machine can have a goal. Essentially that's what they're saying. You're just a machine that just happens to exist. Well, how does the machine have an idea about good and evil? Where did it get that from? It's kind of weird when you think about it. Let's say, in other words, if you have a GPS in your car and you're traveling in some big city, the GPS is programmed with a goal. It can even be a complicated goal, and it can even do all sorts of calculations about how to achieve that goal. But let's say that you take a wrong turn. Well, what does it do when you get off the designed course that the GPS navigation has for you? It just recalculates. Does it care that you went a different way? No, it doesn't consider the goal good or bad. It's just what it's doing. It just functions according to its programming, because that's how it's programmed. And so there's a real logical problem, because the idea of good and evil is inherently is the belief that you're doing something you weren't programmed to do. So if I believe that you have no control over your actions, then like it doesn't matter what you do, you're not evil. So like if it's in some sci-fi world where like, I can like manipulate your body and make you go do bad things with like magic, then are you evil? No, I'm evil because I was in control of everything you did. Okay. Alright, so then the belief in good and evil is a belief in doing things you weren't programmed to do. You weren't controlled into doing. So how can you be controlled into having a belief that you aren't controlled? That's the problem. How? Even if a supernatural wizard, I don't care what a troll, Thor, just magically appears and has a machine and says, I'm going to build a machine with my magic, and then I'm going to program the machine, and my programming is going to say, okay, don't be programmed. Well, that's logically self-contradictory. That's impossible gibberish. That's my point. Okay, so what this means is, even the idea that morality is an illusion, that good and evil is an illusion that you were programmed with by like evolution or some sort of physical processes, that's impossible. So, or if it's not an illusion and it's not a delusion, then there's such thing as good and evil. So there you have it. I don't know where else you could go with this. You could say that morality is like, maybe I didn't say enough about it being a delusion, given that I said so much about it being an illusion. But at the end of the day, so we can jump back to the subjective morality thing since we've made it this far. Is morality a subjective delusion? Well, you really run into major problems if you're saying, well, people make it up. They have souls and spirits, but they just make it up all the time. Well, that means that like everything you do all the time is done because of fantasies. Well, like, how did you decide? It's a chicken or the egg problem. Like, how did you decide like what to make up? Because it can't come from outside you. So like if you make it up, it can't be an illusion that comes from outside you. So like, and you can't make it up, then who? Well, like, I mean, because like, how do you? Which one will you make up? There would be no way for you to decide. You would be at an impasse of like not knowing which one to make up. So like you could say like, okay, I'm going to decide to believe that like murder is good, or I'm going to decide to believe that murder is bad, and like loving your neighbor is good. So hate your neighbor, love your neighbor. Hate your neighbor, love your neighbor. Hate your neighbor, love your neighbor. Which one do I do? Well, I have no preference. No pre-existing preference. I'm making up my preferences right now. There is no objective reality to the difference between the two. One is in no way objectively better or worse than the other. So I'm going to make it up right now. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it up. It is impossible for you to make it up at that point. Because as soon as you make a choice, it's inherent in that choice that you value A over B, but you're making a choice without actually valuing A over B. You don't value one more than the other. You have to have the knowledge that you don't value one more than the other. How do you go about that? We're not talking about some sort of fantasy. We're talking about your core concept of reality being a fantasy. That nothing you do is better or worse than anything else ever. So, like, you could say to me, well, okay, Ben, like, if that, well, how do people ever make up, believe things that aren't true then? Well, it's always to get some other thing that they want that is actually good. So that's totally different. We're talking about creating the concept of wanting things without wanting to do it. That's what we're talking about, which is ridiculous. So there you have it. I mean, it's logically impossible and absurd for God not to exist, because clearly we sense that there's such thing as good and evil. And that sense cannot be an illusion, or else you are programmed to not be programmed, which is self-contradictory and impossible. And it cannot be a delusion, because then you're wanting to do something you don't want to do. It's ridiculous. Like, it's not the same. It's just totally not the same as like other delusions that people create, because people always create them to get something that they previously want. That is usually a good thing. People create delusions of grandeur because grandeur is a good thing and a valuable thing. So it's piggybacking off prior preferences. But we're talking about not wanting anything at all and then wanting something. You would be God if you could do that. Like, you're doing something you don't want to do. Okay, so anyway, given that it's self-contradictory for there to be no God, then therefore God exists. And when I say self-contradictory, I mean that's pretty extreme. So, like, let's look at it this way. Jesus claimed to be God. Muhammad claimed that Jesus is not God. The Hindus claim that everybody is God. And the atheists claim that there is no God. And Oprah claims that they're all correct. Is it logically possible for Oprah to be correct? No. No, you don't have to do any observation. No empirical tests are needed. Oprah cannot possibly be correct. We have it on good reasoning. So this means that God must exist, because we have the same strength of reasoning for the moral argument for God's existence. Given that morality is a fundamental component, of what it means to be a being, because it's just saying that you have that desires are, that's all morality is. It's just a desire about the way things ought to be, about the way the world ought to be, about the way the world should be. And given that we clearly experience objective morality, I mean, if none of us ever even had the experience of objective morality, then like we would never even be talking about it in the first place. It's not that we don't have the experience, it's that can we explain away the experience as a delusion or an illusion? And we can't, because those are self-contradictory ideas. Which means that there must exist a moral lawgiver. I'm not the first person to say this. C.S. Lewis made this argument. It's very similar to Plato's argument for the existence of God, if we want to jump back in time 2,500 years before C.S. Lewis. Athanasius' argument was very similar to Plato's. The book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible is clearly making this argument, but it doesn't make it in
rigorous Aristotelian logic since it predates Aristotle. In the 1200s, in the early Christian universities, Thomas Aquinas is making this argument. So, I mean, for God's existence. So it's not like I'm just coming out of the blue with this, with some wacky idea that I thought up. This is traditional Christianity. Christians have been making this argument for the entire history of the church. I mean, C.S. Lewis lived during World War II. Athanasius lived around 390 A.D. when he made this argument. Augustine lived around 1250 A.D. So 390, 1250, 1940. That spans it pretty well. Okay? And really the book of Ecclesiastes, I think like 800 BC. So, this is nothing new here. The reason we don't know about this stuff is intellectual laziness. And like, you know, I don't think it's something that we need to talk about every day, all the time. But as Peter put it, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make an apologia to anyone who asks you for a reason. Most of the time, you're not going to need to give an apologetic. But you do need to always be prepared to give an apologetic. Because your opportunities to do apologetics tend to just kind of pop up out of the blue, sparsely, not every day all the time, and you just kind of just need to be ready to just jump in the saddle and do it real quick, and usually it's over real fast if you're prepared. But if you don't deal with it, it can become a major roadblock to, people coming closer to Christ or becoming a Christian at all. But most of the time, I don't think it's something, that you really need to talk about all the time. But, hey, let's face facts. God does exist, and it is more likely that Jesus rose from the dead than that he did not. And any of these wiggle attempts out of accepting any of this are ridiculous. And so what that means is, well, there's probably more for us to learn about this. So at least find it interesting. You don't have to be the master of it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to go there. But at the same time, you might, on your off days, enjoy it. And it might be something to, stimulate your brain in a way that you find fun. They found that TV shows that people watch, the more intellectually rigorous they watch them, the higher the ratings are. So TV shows that stretch your brain and push you to think harder, you're more likely to watch, and more people watch them. And so they've been pushing that envelope of making them more and more like that. Whereas in the past, the model was don't make people think hard because they'll change the channel. And so if it works for TV shows, and it works for video games too, video games are they're little logic puzzles. You're making you think, especially the bigger and the grander the game. And so whatever it is, it's a little logical puzzle you're figuring out. And you love to do that, don't you? Well, here's an opportunity for you. Even if no one ever asks you about it, you might enjoy it. But there's a warning from Peter when it comes to doing apologetics. Because he goes on to say, you're always ready to make an apologetic to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And he says, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, which would mean when they say bad things about you that are lies, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So, in other words, like he's saying, you could learn this apologetic stuff and really insult people and make people look stupid and hurt people, and laugh at people and ridicule people because you're right and you are right and they are wrong and they are stupidly wrong. But he's saying, be respectful and be gentle as you answer these people. And keep a good conscience. And so that's way more important. And Peter says, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and... Okay, so we could keep going, but we're going to stop there. Now, may God richly bless you, my beloved.